Typically speaking, money and religion are two topics that you should never talk about, but that's not gonna stop us in this video. Today we're gonna unpack some of the research from Lifeway, where they interviewed thousands of pastors and church leaders to find out exactly what they're getting paid. Whether you're a pastor trying to figure out if your compensation package is fair, or you're on a church board and you wanna make sure that you're paying your church leaders appropriately, this video is gonna break down all the ins and outs that you need to know. Let's do this. When it comes to church compensation, there is no shortage of how much people think pastors should be making. Just do a quick search online and you'll get all kinds of ideas out there. While most people land somewhere in the middle, there really are two extremes when you think about pastor compensation. And as we get started in this, I want to break these two extremes down. The first one is what I would call a poverty mindset. And this is one where churches feel like their pastors should be paid as if their work is an act of service. And by saying that, I mean probably underpaid. There's a culture in those churches where the person with the least is really the one who is the most holy, and that's an unhealthy way to think about pastor compensation. But on the other end of the spectrum is what we might call a prosperity way of thinking when it comes to pastor compensation. In these churches, they think the pastor is a position of honor, which it is, but with that honor should be extravagant blessing. And this is how we get some of those horror stories of pastors that are paid millions of dollars and fly around in private jets. But what factors should we consider when we're trying to determine how much we pay our pastors and church leaders? Well, in this video, we're going to unpack 5 different factors that you need to consider, and we have all the data to go with it so you can see exactly what other churches are paying pastors in a similar position. But I also have 2 factors that you should never consider when you're trying to determine your pastor's salary. We'll unpack those at the end. The first factor you need to consider when determining your pastor's salary is, what is your pastor's role? What is this position for? We all know there's lots of roles in churches. There's a lead pastor or a senior pastor. There's also youth pastors and children's pastors and worship pastors and many people that do lots of the work of the ministry in your church. And that role that they're in plays a large part in how much they should be compensated. The data from Lifeway says that the average senior pastor pay package is just over $90,000. When you consider all churches of all sizes all over the country, $90,000 is the average that a senior pastor would make. But when you compare that with other roles in the church, it can be different. Associate pastors in churches have a pay package that averages $81,000. Music and worship pastors, they make $88,000. Children's pastors, they generally make $65,000, and student pastors make closer to $66,000. One interesting thing to note is that the average salary for an executive pastor, which is the person that runs the day-to-day operations of a church, is actually considerably higher than that of an average lead pastor. It actually comes in at $123,000 a year. And again, we're talking about total pay package when we talk about these numbers here, not the take-home pay. That includes benefits like medical coverage, retirement benefits, time off, all of those kinds of things are factored into this. Only really large churches have executive pastors, and therefore, on average, their pay is higher than what an average lead pastor is of all size churches, which actually brings us to the second factor that you need to consider. After you've taken a look at the role, you need to consider the size of the church. And this plays a huge part in how much pastors are going to be compensated. And again, we're talking about the full compensation package, not just the take-home pay. For very small churches, averaging 1 to 24 people, the average annual compensation is just under $40,000. For slightly larger churches, averaging 25 to 50 people, the average annual compensation is $52,000 a year. Churches of 50 to 75, they pay on average $62,000 a year. 75 to 100, they pay $71,000 a year. Churches of 100 to 150, they pay $78,000 a year, and it jumps all the way up to close to $90,000 a year for churches of 150 to 200 people. For churches of 200 to 300, it's $99,000 a year. For churches of 300 to 500 people, it's $116,000 a year. For churches of 500 to 1,000 people, it's $148,000 a year. And churches over 1,000 have a total compensation of their pastor of $197,000 a year. Now, these numbers are speaking specifically for the lead pastor role, but it also plays a part in some of the other roles within your church. For instance, a youth pastor at a church of 1,000 people will in most circumstances be paid more than a youth pastor in a 100-member church. So church size absolutely comes into play. And maybe you're wondering, why is that? Why is it that we pay more to a pastor that leads a larger church than a smaller church? Aren't they equal in God's eyes? And the truth is, yes, they are equal in God's eyes, but the actual responsibility is much larger with a large organization. So pastors, in most cases, should be paid accordingly, and the numbers seem to bear that out. The third factor that you need to consider is the number of years experience that the pastor or church leader would have. And the numbers seem to bear out that the more experience someone has, the more that they are compensated, which would make sense. The average compensation for someone who's been in the ministry for 1 to 5 years is just under $68,000 a year. For someone who's been in 6 to 10 years, it jumps up to $77,000 a year. $81,000 a year for 11 to 15 years. For 16 to 20 years, the average compensation is $89,000. For 21 to 30 years in ministry, just under $98,000. And if you've been in ministry over 30 years, it's just under $99,000. So again, we see this pattern emerge where the more experience someone has in ministry, the more they are typically compensated. And this, again, it makes sense because with experience in ministry typically comes a lot of expertise, and that should be valuable to churches. Generally speaking, you want someone who is battle tested and has been in the ministry for years and as a pattern of succeeding. The fourth factor you need to consider is the pastor or church leader's education level. And this is really important to take a dive into this. On average, pastors with a high school degree or less are compensated $58,000 per year. Surprisingly, pastors with an associate degree, in fact, make a little bit less than pastors with just a high school degree, although not by much. They're also in that same $58,000 a year range. Pastors with some college but no degree, they on average earn $70,000 a year. Pastors that have gone through and got their bachelor's degree, they make $79,000 a year. Pastors with a master's degree, they make on average $87,000 a year. And pastors with a doctorate degree, well, they're an outlier. They make over $110,000 a year on average. And this also makes sense. While education may not be everything, and we know from scripture that Jesus chose uneducated men in many cases to lead the church, education is an investment that pastors make before they get into ministry, or sometimes while they're doing ministry. So it is something that you should consider when you're trying to figure fair pastor compensation. The fifth and final factor that you should consider is your cost of living in the area. And now, Lifeway doesn't have research on this, but generally speaking, you should be weighing in what the average cost of living in your area is. In my case, I live in Hawaii, which is the most expensive state in the United States to live in, and pastors here should be paid more because the cost of living is so high. That being said, there's some places where the cost of living is lower, such as the Midwest or in the South, where pastors on average are paid a little bit less because the cost of living is much lower. So what you need to do, whether you're a pastor or you're on a board trying to determine what a fair compensation might look like for a pastor, is you need to take these 5 factors into consideration. Use some of those numbers that we laid out to try and figure out, hey, what should someone be getting paid in our area? There is no exact right or wrong answer or exact formula to calculate this, but use your best judgment and come up with a range and start to work from there. Now, I told you in the beginning I was going to uncover 2 things you should never consider, and I want to break those down for you too. The first factor you shouldn't consider, and one that I see churches consider often, is family size. We reason that since this youth pastor has a wife and 4 kids, we probably need to make sure that he is paid more than our children's worker because they're just a single person and probably don't have as many needs as this person. Well, while that makes sense in some ways, it's something we probably ought to resist, and you can get in trouble with some labor laws if you're not careful with that. And the second thing you shouldn't consider is actually kind of like it. You need to be careful not to take age, race, or gender into consideration. Now, I know most of us already kind of understand that you should never take race into consideration. The gospel is pretty clear about that, and we know labor laws are against that, and there's just no reason to ever do something like that. Sometimes I have seen some churches take gender into consideration. If you come from a denominational background that is egalitarian and has women in ministry, well, it's important that whether they're male or female, we do not take that into consideration when determining their salary. And finally, age is something that you shouldn't consider when you're trying to determine a pastor's salary. This is really important, and actually the Lifeway numbers seem to indicate that there is some kind of a connection between pastors' age and salary. As you'd expect, in the early years, pastors tend to make less money, but that's probably more tied to their years of experience than their age. But as pastors tend to get older, we see a dip in Lifeway's numbers where it seems to indicate that older pastors tend to make less than middle-aged pastors. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this could be, and let's remember, correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation, but there are some clear patterns here. I think in general, this is because older people tend to pastor smaller churches, and with that comes a smaller pay. Hopefully this video has been helpful to you. If it has, let us know in the comments down below. Do you take any other factors into consideration when you figure out your pastor's salary? Or if you're a pastor, what do you want people to consider when they're figuring out how much they should be paying you? Drop us a comment down below, and we'll see you next time.